I'm Renee Richard, and I'm in the middle of Jackson Square in New Orleans in front of St. Louis Cathedral. And the city of New Orleans has this wild reputation as a wild partying city, but this is actually a very holy site, because on this site where that church stands is the cradle of Catholicism for the past 300 years. So today we're here to explore that history, so join us on this episode of Roots of Faith. We're here inside of the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, King of France Church, and I have as my guest today Dr. Emily Gagne-Loomis. She is the director of the Archives and Records Center for the Archdiocese of New Orleans. However, she's the former archivist in Baton Rouge back 15 years ago, and my original co-host of various segments of the original Roots of Faith series.
We've been partners in crime for a long
quite
time.
a while, so it's fun to kind of be back for another show. And today we'll be talking about this holy place, this cathedral, and really the 300 years of Catholicism, which we're celebrating this year in New Orleans. You know, when you see a picture of St. Peter's Square, you immediately think of Rome, you know, or when you're in Rome, you think of St. Peter's Square. Let's get that straight. You see Notre Dame, you know, you're in Paris. Well, when you see St. Louis Cathedral anywhere in the United States, it's identified with the city of New Orleans. It's that much of an icon for this city, you know,
Yeah,
the Catholicism.
there's no other city in the United States that, you know, when even football games or anything that is broadcast from the city, it starts with Jackson Square and pans into the cathedral, and everybody knows where you are. You're in New Orleans.
Instantly.
Yeah. Very Catholic. I mean, New Orleans has always been a very Catholic center for the state and just for the whole region, because going back 300 years, when we were under Louisiana rule and then Spanish rule, it was law. You had to be Catholic.
Yeah, that French and Spanish brought with it Catholicism for everyone that was here. But the site that we're on has been holy, has been a church, or the foundation for a church, going back to 1724, so when it was laid out.
Yeah,
originally.
well, you know, in 1718, when Bienville lands, of course there's a missionary priest with him, because all the explorers, whenever
Right.
anyone was coming over and they were establishing different areas, they always had a missionary priest with it. Whether it be a Franciscan, or whether it be a Capuchin, or whether it be a Jesuit, there were always missionaries here in this area. And they actually came prior to the start of New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
New Orleans begins in 1718 when they found the city, and we celebrate that, as you said, with the tricentennial this year. But as part of Bienville, he did choose this spot to build a church. It would take quite a while, a couple of years, before there was a building here. I mean, they said Mass all over, much like we see any small community starting. It's in a warehouse, it's outdoors, it's in a bar, it's in a tavern.
This is being built, right.
Well, you know, it's where can we find space? And as we all know, wherever two or three are gathered in a name, Jesus is in our presence, and that's where church is. So in the beginning, they had to find a place, but this was the ground that they had always selected. When the city was laid out, this site, again, was earmarked for a church to be built here. And that's the church that we see that the plans from the French government is 1724, as we're a colony. And it takes a couple of years before that building is completed, which is 1727.
Right, and that was a wood structure, simple, you know, wood structure building that lasted. There have been 3 buildings actually on this site, correct?
Correct. Well, the first building, so it's the small church, and we are a parish. We are the parish of St. Louis. We're not a cathedral yet. We're not a diocese. We haven't moved into an important area. We're just this little small community known as New Orleans. And so the church is just a community church. It's the very beginning of those roots of Catholicism that are here throughout Louisiana. So when that church is built, that church people are buried here, people are, there's a little graveyard, there's a graveyard outside of town, which is 3 blocks away, which was
Right.
considered outside of town. So there's a lot of growth that's beginning. Houses are beginning to come in. There's beginning to get some warehouses, the King's Warehouse, where food is stored,
Charity
et cetera.
Hospital.
There's a whole lot.
Ursulines,
The
yeah.
Ursulines have arrived. The Ursulines arrive in 1727, which is right at the time when the small church is being erected, and they're blessing it and they're coming in. So there's a lot going on in that beginning. They've started a boys' school in early on, about 1726 in the city. And so there's things, and there's movement, and there's Catholicism that has already taken root. By the Spanish period, which we know begins in the 1760s, in 1788, on Good Friday, it's March 21st, there's a fire that starts. And Père Antoine, who is the rector of the cathedral at the time, the rector of the church, was still not a cathedral,
Right.
but who's the rector here, he then sounds, everyone's scrambling because we have this.
Put out the fire.
Put out the fire. When that fire happens, it destroys the church.
Well, there was-
it actually
yeah.
destroys 3/4 of the
80%
city.
of the city, because there was a very strong wind blowing then.
It was. The fire stops before it takes out the convent of the Sisters of Ursuline. And we have a great story that evolves around that convent, which I know we'll tell at a later date. But it's that church, that first structure, that burns to the ground. And it's very hard for the people because there's no place for them
And everything
to
revolved
go.
around church in that day and time.
And there's very little for them. I mean, with the exception of the Ursulines in the chapel there, they have to start saying, they're certainly saying Mass on that campus, but there's really just an influx. There's actually another fire that happens several years later in 1794. In the meantime, in 1793, we've become a diocese. So under the French, we were part of the Diocese of Quebec. Under the Spanish, we were part of the Diocese of Cuba and Havana. And then we become a diocese in 1793. And that's when we really start to see growth.
When we took a break, we were talking about now we're a diocese here, the Diocese of Louisiana. I think it was Louisiana and Florida's
Yes.
when it first began. And that was in the 1790s, and that fire was in the 1780s. So now they have built now a new church. It took a while to build too, though, also. But a church that looked totally different than what we envision now.
Right. So that first church after the fire that Don Almonaster E. Rojas builds. He's the philanthropist that puts up the money to be able to build that first cathedral, because we become a cathedral as that church is being blessed.
Okay.
Because whenever you become a diocese, that's when you get your cathedral. So we've gotten our first bishop. The bishop is Bishop Luis Penover y Cardenas, and he is here, and he's beginning, things are changing within the diocese. The Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas encompasses all of what we know as Louisiana Purchase, as well as what we call the two Floridas, which is East and West Florida, which, takes not only the panhandle, but
all
also
the way across.
all the way across and all the way down into Miami. So that's the whole vast territory. Today, you have over 40 dioceses that are part of that vast territory. But that's what happens, and it's the second diocese in the United States,
Right.
the first being Baltimore in 1789. So the first cathedral is built. It only has 2 spires on the outside. There's no central spire. There's just sort of this, there's a tall, it doesn't look like you'll see the picture of it, of what it looks like. So that is what is built in 1794. That's what comes next. What then happens is around 1810, they decide to have a central spire with a clock, and that is designed by Benjamin Latrobe. And Benjamin Latrobe is important because he's the architect in Washington, D.C., for the Capitol. So it's the same architect. He's here. He dies, though, of yellow fever after the designs are in, and somebody else completes that design. And that's when it takes on that traditional shape
As
of
we know
what we
now.
know of the three spires that you see. But
Even then, it
even
didn't
that's going to
have-
change.
right.
You know, it looks like three bells on top. Kind of reminds me even of in Baton Rouge, where we have the at Holy Rosary, that the bell tower, you know, sort of on the top that's done. That's what they kind of look like then, with the mosaics on it. So they didn't have mosaics, but it was certainly that shape of what those churches looked like back then.
And by then, we're now the United States, 1810.
Right, right.
So we have now become part of the United
And
States,
things have
which is a big
changed.
change.
It is a
And a
big
big change
change.
in the church and Catholicism. We go through a major priest shortage during that time.
Right, right.
As
And
well.
we're without a bishop for a good long time.
Yes.
So from 1803 until 1816, 1815,
16, somewhere there.
we don't have a bishop. We're ministered to by Baltimore. We never fall under Baltimore, but they're helping out and making decisions for us. And so there's a lot moving on there. The other thing that's really important for that time period is Catholicism is no longer the mandated religion. Under the French, under the Spanish, it was mandated. Everyone had to be Catholic. You almost had to have permission to be here if you weren't. So now you have freedom of religion. And that's going to change. We're going to have that influx of Protestants coming in. We're going to have Jewish people coming in. We've already had, you know, other Protestants, Episcopals, and Jewish people already coming into the community. But that's when we really are going to see a bigger push. We're also going to see English coming in,
It is.
which is really going to affect New Orleans.
Right. But throughout all of this city has maintained its Catholic flair. And that's it. You know, it's always been exotic. It's always been multicultural. Now it's multi-religious in multiple, you know, religions. Yet the Catholicism part of it, the influx of what was there, has never left, even from that point on. But you're right. When the English come,
The English come. So the English come. This is the only place to celebrate Mass. That and the exception being, of course, the Ursulines that have their chapel, which is just theirs. But the only church in New Orleans is the cathedral.
It's here.
And that stays true until 1835, when there's enough English, the Irish have started to come in, and they are going to demand that God speak English, because in this church, God speaks French. And so there's a lot of, you know, as those that speak English coming in, and of course Louisiana Purchase, and the government language is English. But here in New Orleans, they still speak French, and as we know, they speak French for a very long time. So there's a lot going on during that time period. In 1835, though, the other really significant thing that happens for the church is we get a bishop whose name is Bishop Antoine Blanc. He had been in Point Capee. His brother had also been in the diocese.
In Baton Rouge. Of course, we are part of this diocese
right,
then.
you are.
But he served in Baton Rouge very much so.
Well, the whole state is, as we talked about before. We're now, by 1835, we've now, the diocese,
Branched out. Yeah.
it's just the Diocese of Louisiana, and will become the Diocese of New Orleans, but it takes both, basically the whole state. So that's then moving forward. So we get Antoine Blanc. And Bishop Blanc is very important because he starts so many parishes, and he grows the church, and he grows in that multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-racial. We really are growing as a church. By 1850, then, we become an archdiocese, and he becomes the first archbishop for New Orleans.
And those years between 1835 and 1852 is the antebellum period. People were flocking here.
Yeah.
The chance to get rich, too. So, I mean, that growth is really expanding.
And what's going to change then is the church, because the other thing that they do in 1850 is they make a larger church. This footprint that we know today is based off of that 1850 renovation.
Right.
And that's the part that I'm really excited about, being able to show you around a little bit about what this structure looks like after 1850, which is the footprint that we see right here and today. And it's great because, you know, we're 300 years, and in the last more than 150, 168
170,
years,
yeah,
you know,
roughly here,
this is
this
what
church.
the church has looked like.
This cathedral now really has not changed much in terms of the physical structure, although there's been changes as we have continued to grow. Tell us a little bit about the continuation of the story of this place.
Sure. So after 1850, of course, we are going to have the Civil War. The city is overtaken in 1862, but the church sort of remains the same as far as the footprint of what you see here.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, this was like central. So many people were Catholic. The news, everything going on
Everything's
with the war.
coming
I mean,
through here.
all the news, whether it's war or otherwise, would be spread before and after church. That's
Exactly.
just how it is in South Louisiana, but
Exactly.
especially here in New Orleans, right?
And
Didn't
this
mean to
is
interrupt
no,
you on
no,
this,
no.
but
This
that's
is
so true.
and this is what you and I
This is
do
it.
all the time.
I know.
our bickering and bantering and research and history, and it's great. So, one of the things that we also look at in all of this is then what's happening in the footprint of the church. So the church itself, again, multi-ethnic, multiracial, everyone is here actually doing, having service, having mass, worshiping in the same space. And outside, there's certainly racial tension, there's certainly the Jim Crow laws, but there's something I've sort of started using a lot when I talk about being inside of church. And at that time, and throughout the history of New Orleans and throughout the history of Catholicism, there's no discrimination at the baptismal font. So everyone is welcome to be baptized. Everyone is welcome, no matter what walk of life. So we see that continuing here. And there's no discrimination at the baptismal font. And so, you're then moving into the 1900s, and things are again changing. And we have some events that happen. There's a bomb. They're not
Yeah,
sure
many
if it's
people
a
are aware of
dynamite
that.
bomb that goes off in church, and it ruins some of the windows, and it has some problems. 1915 is a huge hurricane. It happens on September 29th in 1915. It's a Category 4. It really does a lot of damage to the cathedral. It does a lot of damage, so much so that they have to have mass in other places.
Right.
They actually have a small spot outside of church here in what was the garden, St. Anthony's Gardens. And so we have to close. We close on Easter in 1916 because the city says it's a health hazard to keep the building open. At that point in time, then they do another renovation. And we see some of the pieces of that renovation in the steel bars that are holding the walls.
together.
And there's just some pieces here. They've had to redo some of the windows. But that 1916 renovation is really some of the last renovations we've had until we hit Vatican II. Which again, the altar is going to move into the front.
Right.
The priest is going to face front. We see those things. Statues have come and gone into the sanctuary. But the other thing that really happens to us in the 1960s is this is named a minor basilica. And when that happens, there's a
explain that.
ceremony of blessing, and the basilica, a minor basilica, is tied to the major basilicas in Rome, and we are then partnered with Saint Maria Maggiore, Mary Major, in Rome. So that's the major basilica that we
And there's certain
partnered
things
with.
here that identify us as a basilica, for those who don't know.
Absolutely.
what those
So
three
we have.
items
I'm going
are.
to use the two that are on either side of the sanctuary when you come in to the church. And one is, I'll use the vernacular. One is the umbrella, which has the symbol of the Pope as well as the Archdiocese on it. And the other is the bell, the Tannenbaum, which is what they ring when they're processing in. So that happens in the 1960s. We become a basilica. But we don't stay known as the St. Louis Minor Basilica. We don't want to do that, right? We want to we're so ingrained in the St. Louis Cathedral that we actually maintain the term, the St. Louis Cathedral. The last we have two other major events that happened in the last 40 years, one being the Pope's visit. And he visited here in the 1980s, which was just extraordinary. and he said Mass here in this
And how holy is that?
I know. So
To
we
have
had a
the
saint.
Pope here,
Yeah,
and
we
a
had
saint.
The
Well, several
saint that was
saints have been here.
Right. But I mean, the most modern one
Modern
that we
one.
have is here. And we have a beautiful statue that has just been blessed.
unveiled, yeah.
Unveiled for the
In the last
tricentennial.
2 days.
Yep, that's outside of the cathedral. And so that's a great place to start when you're walking in, as you get to see St. John Paul II, and he's standing there with some children, and we just, as you said, bless that for the tricentennial. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot still going on in the church as we start celebrating the tricentennial.
You know, in this church, there's so much of its history that's physical, that you see, that are either paintings on the walls or windows, flags, so many other things. So let's take a look at the history through what is here physically
Certainly.
for our viewers.
Yeah. So when you first walk into the church, there's statues on either side of the door. One, of course, is St. Joan of Arc, because she is so important to the city, matron of Orleans, Maid of Orleans, and so she's part of that, as well as St. Louis, King of France. As you continue in, you then see, as we talked about before, the umbrella and the bell, which signify the basilica. And then you're walking down this beautiful central aisle, and the central aisle is done in marble. It's in black and white, and it was done by a man. His last name was Wahlberg, and Mr. Wahlberg was a free man of color who was commissioned in the 1850s to lay the floor, and he was an expert marble mason, layer, whatever, whoever, person, artist. That's a better way of putting it, sorry. And so anyway, he's the one that laid out the floor, and it's absolutely beautiful. The other part that, as you continue into the front, where you see the altar, you also see in the tabernacle. That tabernacle will actually change. So right now, you will see what you see is the ciborium and the host, and so that will also change throughout the year. So there's pieces for Easter, and it's three different sides. There's three different sides. So the door actually changes depending on what's being displayed. The altar itself, as you go all the way up, we have St. Peter and St. Paul in as statues, and we also across the top have faith, hope, and charity. So those are beautiful statues that are here. The stained glass up at the top is very plain stained glass. And the stained glass that we see up at the top is just, I call it plain, but it's actually beautiful.
It is beautiful.
You don't
it doesn't
see
depict something. Right.
Exactly. But what you do see down on the first floor, is all of the life of St. Louis. And you see his birth, you see his conversion, you see the Crusades, you see his ministering to the sick, you see his mother, and then you see his death, and you see his canonization. So people don't realize when they're sitting in church here that the life of St. Louis, King of France,
who not only this church, but the state of Louisiana named after.
Exactly. So it is all his life in those windows. So there's a great history there in those windows.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that either.
Yeah. We also have people buried here. So
I knew that.
Yep, we do
Going
have.
back
We have
many
about
generations.
100 people, 110 people that we can actually put names to, but our records, because of the fire, aren't always they're not
100%
complete. And so we know some people that are buried here. Our bishops have been buried here, and we have beautiful plaques, which would remind you of a tombstone for each bishop. We also have information about each bishop that's up on the wall. And we have the portraits of each bishop that's up in the ceiling.
See that? I think people really aren't aware that our ceilings are painted in here with all of them, including
Well, Archbishop Hughes, who was the bishop in
and
in New
Antoine
Orleans.
Blanc,
Antoine Blanc.
first Archbishop, but of course is near and dear to our diocese, to Baton Rouge.
Sure. Jansen's, all of them. They're all up in the ceiling. The only one that's not in the ceiling yet is Archbishop Gregory Amen, because his portrait hasn't been commissioned yet, and his spot, it's there, but his portrait is not up in the ceiling yet. So it's great to be able to, you really do get the history of the bishops, and you get what each one of them looked like, and from that very first bishop, Penoveri Cardenas, to
an understanding of the Catholicism here
Yep,
in
to
this
all
one
the
structure.
archbishops. So
Now,
it's really
a famous
nice.
artist, an Italian artist, who was living in the city, did a series of paintings. Now, he did paintings for the Ursuline Convent, which we did in one of our exhibits, and that is Peretti.
Peretti. He's here in the 1900s, and he actually does some of the touch-ups and some of the murals here. So he does some of the large portraits that you see are his. It'll say Achille or Achille Peretti. But Umbrek is the other one that did the mural and did the touch-up work because, you know, years of layers and layers of paint, you have to go back and continue to either rework or
160
redo.
years,
yes.
yeah.
So, you know, you still see French. You see, when we look up in the ceiling, you have certainly Jesus, and you have the Lamb of God. You have we do have some Latin in the works, but we also have St. Louis, King of France. And he announces the Seventh Crusade, and that, of course, is in French as well. So you get both French and Latin throughout the church. The last thing that I think I want to sort of point out in the church is the flags. And the flags have some really good significance here, and you don't think about those things as you're walking through. When you walk into the church, the flags that are on the left side are all the dioceses that are in Louisiana, in the province of Louisiana. So you see Lafayette, Houma-Thibodaux, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Shreveport, Alexandria, and Lake Charles. So I think I've got them all. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. But so you see all of them.
That left side.
Yes, you have then the United States flag, and then you have the papal flag down at the very front of the church on that left-hand side. On the right-hand side is all the governments that have been in Louisiana, affiliated here or control the territory. And those range from under the Castilian Spanish flag, then the Bourbon French flag. Those are the monarchies. Then we go into Spanish control. Then we get the British, when we know how that sort of worked with Baton Rouge.
That's right.
Then we have the English, so the British, and then the Americans. Then you have the different flags of the Americas. You have the state of Louisiana flag. We also have when we were under the Confederacy, and then we have the United States flag. So that really shows you all the governments that were part of this. But the church was constant. So even though the governments change, organizations
changed, but that hasn't.
And that's what we're celebrating with the Tricentennial, is it's 300 years of Catholicism, and the Catholic Church has been here, and the Catholic Church has not changed as we've moved along there. So this church, what you're seeing, where you are, is a great symbol of that Catholicism that's here in Louisiana and how long it's been here and how it's that centerpiece of Louisiana and the centerpiece of New Orleans.
And a very holy place.
It is.
You know? So we've had so much fun doing this all over again like we used to do. I thank you for being our guest today, folks. I hope you have learned something about our great cathedral that so often you take for granted when you live, you know, within a region. You don't see it all. I know, myself included, like I'm going to check out all the portraits. But thank you for being our guest today, and we're going to work on doing some more. So
that'd be great.
Join us again for another episode of Roots of Faith.